So I would like to welcome everyone to our first module of the learning series, Understand, Design, Act, Climate Proof Your Supply Chain. I would like to welcome again everyone. I see participants pouring in from all around the world, from all sorts of countries, let me have a look. I see retailers there, I see traders, I see the civil society, I see research representatives. So yeah, we're having a very good mix of participants here. While people are still coming in, I will start and introduce myself. I'm Caroline Glofka from the Global Coffee Platform. I'm a program manager and facilitating the Climate Smart Agriculture Collective Action Network. With me today, bringing this webinar to you, is Catherine Silingia, program manager from the Hans-R Neumann Stiftung. So welcome, Catherine, and also Keely Sloan, project manager from Sustainable Food Lab. Welcome to both of you, and we will bring this webinar to you today. What are we going to cover today? So let's have a look at the agenda. For those who are not so familiar with the Collective Action Network Climate Smart Agriculture, I'm going to tell you a little bit what we have done and where that sits. Explain this learning series, how it came up and why we're doing this. And then I will hand over to Keely and Kate, who will bring to you knowledge on climate change and understanding that. And we will have plenty of time for a question and answer session. Before we start, we are using Zoom for this call. I would like to familiarize yourself a little bit how to use this. So as this is a webinar, you cannot easily talk, but of course you can raise your hand, which you find on the bottom as a button. And for making comments or asking later questions. For questions, we would like you to ask the question and answer box when it comes to the question and answer session. So we will try to answer all questions. When you raise your hand, we can make you allow you to speak. Otherwise, your microphone will be muted. And please remember that this session is being recorded, as we want to make it available for other people who cannot join today. And it will be found on our website later. So let's put into context a little bit where this Collective Action Network Climate Smart Agriculture contributes to GCP goals. So our goal is to develop a thriving and sustainable coffee sector. And this is supported and based on the Sustainable Development Goals. And under our thriving and sustainable coffee sector goal, there are 3 areas that we are focusing on, which is improving livelihoods of farmers, which you see is number 1 on the slide, and number 2 is farmer prosperity. That's number 2. But this collective action network with climate smart agriculture comes with a number 3, which is conservation of natural resources. The collective action network climate smart agriculture also has a goal, a target, and it's to help farmers to adapt and build resilience towards climate change and its consequences. How do we do this? Or with whom do we do this rather? Is coffee sector partners to formulate concrete action in building resilience towards climate change and its consequences for coffee. So this is where this collective action network comes in. So GCP, let's take a step back. Last year, we have conducted a few webinars where we learned from participants, also in a workshop that we offered, that there is quite a confusion on what climate change, what effects it has. There is much knowledge, but where is it actually? How can it be available? How do I design a strategy? And based on that, we then partnered with the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, which is a consortium of 7 organizations to build this learning series and bring more knowledge into the coffee sector. Also, GCP this year is going to develop with further 4 partners a climate catalog, which will be brought to you later in the year. And in module 3, I will tell you a little bit more about that. So, yeah, this is fantastic. When you registered for this webinar, we asked you to put in your thoughts on what you wanted to learn and get out of this webinar. And I have picked only a few of the organizations and what they have said, but I think it's a good representation of what people have said. So Olam says they want to learn more about partnerships and practices to scale up CSA initiatives in the coffee sector. And Solidaridad wants to hear from other experts on cutting-edge strategies, technical and financial models, and opportunities for collaboration. And Nestle wants to improve their knowledge to share with stakeholders and get more information to support their point of view. And Volcafe wants to get a better understanding of the diverse possibilities there are to address the issue of climate change and a functional network with whom climate change can be addressed and its implications tackled. So all this, not in this webinar in module 1, but throughout the 7 we're going to bring to you, we are all going to cover and address those issues. But it's not all about learning. Of course, there is an array of already activities out in the coffee sector happening that people are doing. So Yara, for example, is doing scientific research trials to better define the possibility contribution to adaptation for them. Curate Green Mountain sees climate change as a significant risk and addresses that by diversifying their supply base and funding varietal research and development and support for farmers to adopt climate-smart agricultural practices. Then IDH is, as mentioned before, develop a climate catalog, partnering with others to innovate and develop upscaling models. And Sustainable Harvest says, and this is a long quote now, I believe climate risk is one of the most sustainable elements facing the industry. Our organization currently has many direct relationships with producers in which we broadly discuss the threat. But I don't believe we integrate climate discussion or solutions as much as we should. And I think this is a good quote, which is true for a lot of organizations who are already doing something, but more can be done. And of course, there are also huge gaps that still need to be addressed. Let's look at the objectives of this learning series. So what will you actually get? We're going to bring to you an understanding of climate change, the problems, and the latest research. But also, I mean, there will be parts that are still missing, of course, and that need to be done. And how can this, so this learning that you are receiving hopefully then helps you to plan, implement, and scale the effects of CSA. It's to learn how to to assess your supply chain risks. But as mentioned, there are still some gaps. So even if you participate in this module, and I'll show you how it's set up, much more needs to be done. And then convey the value of investment in CSA to your company and to others. And all this is then to align the actions, your actions with others, to collaborate and to bring concrete action to origin. So how is this learning series set up, and why did we do it the way it is? So today you will find an introduction which will make you understand climate change and introduce some terminology and climate change. And then we move on, and the next one, which is next week, Tuesday, on climate change and what effects it has on the supply chain, which will show risk profiles. And then how can these effects be managed? There we will introduce various tools, so solutions that are available right now. And then you probably would want to know how to scale it. So that would be then the next module. And if you scale, probably you also want to understand what the impact is, and that's monitoring. And the next step is, okay, now I have it all in place. How can I convince colleagues in my company or others with whom I want to work together that this makes sense? And then in the same context, it's collaboration, how to work together, how does it work? So with these different modules, we want you to understand, design a project or a project and act. What if you do this individually, fine, but we're also going to show you our opportunities in Honduras and Uganda, which we are developing right now, where we will during this webinar introduce to you concrete topics, and they are still in the development. So we are talking to the platforms in Honduras and Uganda, but it of course will contribute to their agendas, to the National Coffee Platform agenda. It will be a multi-stakeholder collaboration. Learnings and results will be shared with the sector because that's the way we work, and progress will be measured. Throughout the learning series, we will also continue to give examples from those two countries, but also of others. And then in the end, show you where concrete investment is needed in those two countries. We have an array of experts brought together, mainly from the Alliance from Resilient Coffee. I won't introduce them all, but you will get to know them throughout the learning series. And I'm very thrilled that they are ready to share their expertise with us. So a thank you in advance to everyone. And with that, I would like to hand over to Catherine and Kili to continue this webinar.
Great, thanks Caroline. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. We're really excited about this series and looking forward to both the learning journey we're going to go on during the modules, and then the ultimate action that we hope to take within Honduras and Uganda. Oh, I did not turn my camera on. Hi everyone. So as Caroline said, my name is Catherine Kate Salangia. I'm a program manager at the Neumann Foundation, which is the leading organization overseeing the Future Alliance for Resilient Coffee, or the ARC program as we refer to it. So I wanted to just give a little background on that project before we jump into the content for this first module. So Caroline, if you can change the slide, please.
Hang on.
Okay, so the Feed the Future Alliance for Resilient Coffee is a project that is funded by USAID. It is part of the Feed the Future initiative for global food security. And the intent broadly is to bring together a group of organizations that have complementary expertise on the topic of climate change and coffee production, with the intent to reduce the confusion that Caroline mentioned within the sector on how climate threats are affecting coffee and really what can be done. Next slide, please. So the ARC Consortium is composed of organizations that are working at and with perspectives on every level of the value chain, from the plant all the way up to the roaster. So starting with the plant, we have World Coffee Research, leading research and development on resilient coffee varieties in combination with climate smart farming practices. On the farm, we have the Neumann Foundation, which has hands-on experience with climate adaptation extension using our validated coffee and climate methodology. We have the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture, which has used its research on coffee and cocoa farmer typologies to help to prioritize the most relevant on-farm CSA practices to make extension more efficient. At the kind of farmer organization or cooperative level, Root Capital as a social lender is evaluating the business case for climate smart agriculture and exploring ways to de-risk the adoption of CSA strategies. Conservation International brings its extensive environmentalist expertise to examine coffee's role within multidimensional landscapes. The International Center for Tropical Agriculture, or CIAT, analyzes macroclimate risks, both using machine learning algorithms to model long-term climate impacts on coffee production, and also examining and exploring different roles that various value chain actors can play in incentivizing climate smart agriculture. And then we have Sustainable Food Lab, which brings its experience in engaging with the private sector across a number of different agribusinesses to help us understand the chief drivers and the barriers to adoption of CSA within the coffee sector. So we're really bringing a comprehensive experience from a number of different levels. Next slide, please. And our goal is to increase uptake of climate smart agriculture within the sector. So we're approaching this in 4 steps, essentially. So starting with our own internal alignment around what climate smart agriculture is, how we think about it as individual organizations, and then how the ways in which we are each approaching CSA can come together into a coordinated approach and a clear message to the sector. And in doing that, that process of internal alignment, we're also sharing our existing tools and creating new tools. And then we're testing these tools in pilot locations in Guatemala, Honduras, and Uganda. And we will be sharing these tools with piloting opportunities for the sector, as well as in knowledge sharing opportunities like this one. And in doing this, we're hoping to address some of the key challenges that we've seen in the past in making investments in climate smart agriculture. So things that have come up from the sector have been, again, the lack of clarity on what climate smart agriculture is and what that looks like really in practical terms, which, hopefully we're going to start to demystify in this module and certainly in the rest of the series. But also the fact that there won't be one standard solution or set of solutions for all contexts. There are varying capacities of farmers to adopt CSA practices, and there's clearly a need to collaborate to effectively combat the mounting challenge of climate change, both as NGOs and amongst coffee companies. Next slide, please. So we're very pleased to be able to collaborate with the Global Coffee Platform on this webinar series because it gives us the opportunity to help to spread our knowledge and to facilitate this exchange of knowledge within this group on this topic, and also to introduce coffee companies to our tools and our resources that can help to fortify coffee supply chains. And so we as a consortium help companies in these ways. You can click to the next. So we produce climate risk analysis at the level of the company, the country, landscape, farmer organization, and farming household. Next, we lead and support CSA implementation. So direct implementation, including a training of trainers approach to climate adaptation extension, the development of farmer organization level climate adaptation plans, and then landscape and community level adaptation plans that involve multiple stakeholders. And then we design and implement testing and research on CSA practices, including the use of resilient varieties in varying contexts to gauge their effectiveness. So we'll be highlighting these different areas and going deeper into the specific tools throughout this series. Next slide. So now we skip to the objective of this first module, the introduction. The objective here is to introduce ourselves and to orient you to the topic of climate smart agriculture. So we're going to start by defining some of the terms related to climate change and to climate smart agriculture. We'll introduce some of the ways in which climate change is challenging coffee production. And then we'll highlight different ways that coffee companies, depending on their role within the value chain and their relationship and proximity to producers, can support improved climate resilience. So coffee production, as most of you know, is highly dependent on a regular sequence of weather events. So you need a dry season that's long enough to stress the trees so that they can flower well, but not too long or the trees will become weak. You need a good soaking to initiate flowering, but you don't want continuous rain because that will affect the fruit set. Not too high a temperature, which can cause a number of different physiological problems, including flower abortion. You want regular rainfall through the berry development stage, but then you need a drier period for the harvest and post-harvest so that the coffee can dry sufficiently. So this regular sequence of weather events in coffee producing regions just can't be assumed anymore. We see a number of effects of climate change. The world is warming. So the world's average temperature is rising, especially minimum temperatures. So although the rate of change is slow, it might not even be detectable to some farmers in some places, but it is rising. And pests and disease may grow much quicker when a certain threshold, which may not be easy to measure and may even be unknown, when that threshold is crossed, pests and diseases may proliferate. Although the world is on average warming, the rate of global warming is uneven across the world. So this is because, you know, the oceans, they absorb most of the sun's energy and then move it around through horizontal and vertical currents. So there may be many years in which average ambient temperatures don't actually rise significantly. And parts of the world may even experience cooler seasons as the seasonal winds shift and cause warming in other parts of the world. Global rainfall is increasing. So because the warmer air holds more moisture, this doesn't necessarily mean that all regions are going to receive more rain. More likely it is that when it does rain, it just rains a lot harder. And so particularly for coffee and other crops that typically grow on slopes, this means that soil erosion and landslides are likely to become increasing problems. And as most people have witnessed, the world is experiencing more extreme weather. So areas are becoming hotter, wetter, drier, even cooler, but we're also seeing increasing frequency of severe weather events. So again, coffee farmers are experiencing more extreme weather, both hot and cold. Next slide, please. So for this first session, I wanted to go through a few of the key terms that we're going to be using throughout the series. These are terms that you are familiar with and probably use on a daily basis, but we want to make sure that everyone understands kind of the differences between some of them, because some are often used interchangeably, but do have some specific differences. So first, weather, you know, this is generally the current atmospheric conditions at a particular place at a particular time. So the weather, look outside your window right now, that's the weather. Climate is then the weather averaged over a long period of time, so typically 30 years or more. And then you might refer to climate variability, which means the variations in the current state of the climate. So again, over a longer period than weather, but not quite at the level of decades, which is then referring to climate change. So any significant change in climate over an extended period of time. And that is considered climate change regardless of how you attribute the cause of that. It could be natural variability or human activity. The point is that there's a significant trend and change in climate. Next slide. Then, as I mentioned, global warming is this increase in average global temperature. So, you know, it may be getting hotter in some places more than others, but overall global temperatures are rising. And then there's local warming, which is important to distinguish because that can be caused by a change in land use. So typically, you know, deforestation, and that can exacerbate the local climate conditions and extremes. When we say climate hazards, we're talking about the potentially damaging weather events or the conditions that might affect, you know, in this case, coffee production. So changes in rainfall patterns, floods, wind, droughts, etc. And then the climate impacts are, excuse me, the effects of climate change overall on natural or human farming production systems. Next slide, please. So how does this affect coffee overall? So as I mentioned, there are global trends towards hotter and wetter, and that affects coffee differently in different places. But by and large, we can say, farmers are increasingly experiencing extreme and unpredictable weather and climate patterns, and they can't, expect the same favorable conditions that, especially a perennial crop like coffee, needs for consecutive harvests. So this has major implications on their livelihoods and their strategies. When climate change is causing both discrete short-term shocks, such as this variability and floods, for example, and then also gradual long-term stressors like multi-year warming trends, farmers are often facing a dilemma of deciding, should they invest more in adapting to these new climate hazards, or should they diversify, potentially even moving away from coffee? So these questions and these considerations are compounded by the natural risk exposure of a particular farmer or region, meaning, what is their altitude, what is the angle of the slope that they're farming on. So next slide, please. So for example, depending on where you're working in Honduras, the changes will be different, as will the solutions. So we can see here, this is a snapshot of some of the climate effects that we've looked at in the country level risk profile that we'll be going through in more detail next week. But you can see here across the board on the left side, in terms of weather trends, we're seeing increases in the number of storms, high winds, increasing temperatures, and especially temperatures at night, droughts, irregular rainfall. These are effects that coffee across the country is experiencing, and this affects coffee in a number of ways, including increasing the incidence of pests and diseases, soil erosion, irregular flowering, and post-harvest risks. But notably, that depending on the area of Honduras you're looking at, the long-term stressors may be more or less severe. And so some areas may continue to produce coffee with some adaptations to these new, more frequent shocks. And then some areas may no longer be suitable even with adaptations because of these long-term stressors. So knowing what types of climate risks your supply chain is facing and to what degree can help you to identify the risk areas and the appropriate solutions that correspond with those risks. So again, this is going to be further elaborated on in the next module of the learning series on assessing climate risks. Next slide, please. And so there's this growing recognition of the risks posed by climate change and the need to integrate the response to these risks with the aims of agriculture development for smallholder farmers led to the coining of the term climate smart agriculture. So this was a term that was coined by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in 2010. And their main focus at that time was on the actions needed to transform and reorient agricultural systems to support development and also ensure food security in the face of changing climate. And so the focus was on food security. That was sort of the impetus for the development of this term and this approach. But the concept is a triple win approach. So the idea is sustainably increasing agricultural productivity and incomes and food security, adapting and building resilience to climate change, and reducing or removing greenhouse gases wherever possible. You can click to the definitions of those three. Caroline, next slide, or next, yeah. And so this doesn't mean that all CSA practices or strategies will entail all three of these aspects. And in fact, it's really quite difficult to accomplish all three with one practice or one strategy. So there are trade-offs to manage. And our focus as a consortium has primarily been on adaptation and resilience and productivity food security. So those two two of those circles. That's both because we're a program under the Feed the Future initiative, and that is very clearly focused on food security and smallholder livelihoods. And also because there has already been significant global focus put on mitigation within and outside of the coffee sector, and it was noted in the development of this program that companies had previously struggled with engaging in adaptation. So that's kind of our core, our focus in this project. Next slide. So this term is thrown around a lot, and you can give the FAO definition, and I think people typically understand it conceptually, but struggle with what does that really mean in practice? What are we talking about doing? And so as a consortium, we've discussed, and our perspective is that climate smart agriculture can be broken into these three types of actions. So first of all, we have practices. These are the actual activities implemented on the farm by a farmer to adapt typically to current climate variability. So this would be things like planting cover crops, managing shade, introducing trenches, these kinds of farming practices. Then you have strategies that could be implemented on the farm or off the farm. It could be a farmer, cooperative, a community, or really any level of the supply chain. But the idea is that this is developing a strategy that can help to adapt to current climate variability and start to prepare for long-term climate change. So it's really more around the decision making. And then we have these enablers, which are essentially the conditions that are needed to kind of support the implementation of strategies and practices. So again, this could be supported by really anyone, including various levels of the coffee value chain, by governments of coffee producing countries, by the public sector, etc. But here we're talking about things that make it more feasible to implement strategies and adopt practices. So things like access to finance, access to weather insurance, installing weather stations to collect more data on the climate hazards being faced, or investing in research on resilient varieties, that kind of thing. So just to make a point, many of you on the call are likely already implementing or supporting activities like the ones that I just mentioned. And you may or may not be characterizing those things as CSA, as climate smart agriculture. But CSA is not really about starting from scratch. So there may be, especially at the practice level, a lot of overlap with good agricultural practices that we've known are effective for some time. But really, the key here is the need to reevaluate your priorities and the actions that you invest in with a climate lens. Okay, so next slide, please. And I just wanted to give a little teaser from the third module. So when selected appropriately, CSA practices can be very effective. So here you see an example of a coffee farm in Honduras at 900 meters above sea level. They're facing drought and rising temperatures, and that has been making coffee farming very difficult. But you can see over the course of a couple of years, dramatic improvements with the introduction of cover crops and temporary shade. We saw, if you click to the data that pops up, so we saw with the introduction of cover crops and temporary shade, soil temperature stayed lower, soil moisture was retained, and root systems grew deeper and stronger. But most importantly, we saw, you can see here, significant improvement in yield and subsequently in income. So, both yield and income more than tripled compared to the control. So there are effective adaptations that can be made to improve the resilience of coffee production. Next. But the appropriate actions are going to depend on the level of risk being faced. So again, in the future modules, we're going to look more deeply at the kinds of actions that are required within different risk gradients, as well as the kind of actions that should be taken up by and supported by different members of the coffee sector. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Keely, who's going to talk about different members of the coffee sector.
Great, thanks, Kate. And hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about company investment in climate smart agriculture. And a lot of the findings I'm about to talk about come from a private sector consultation on engagement in climate smart coffee that we did with the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, where we spoke to 18 global coffee companies and 10 national level coffee actors in Uganda. And just so you know, the report is cited in the resources page later on in this module if you'd like to take a closer look. So the ways in which the private sector supports farmers to build resilience to climate change or engage in efforts to mitigate climate change can have a really significant impact on the ability for farmers to make a living, the security of supply of smallholder crops, and the reputation of private sector actors drawing loyalty of end customers, partners, or investors. Go ahead, thanks. Companies are well aware of the risk of climate change, and the risk is often the driver for actions and investments in climate smart agriculture. Most coffee companies are concerned with both reputational risks, such as deforestation, child labor, water management, and farmer poverty, as well as supply risks, including profitability of coffee so that current farmers, as well as the next generation, will continue to grow it, coffee quality, area available for coffee production, and in line with that, decreasing yields. Next, please. Companies act differently in response to climate risk because they have access to different climate information about their supply chains and different priorities for investment. So let's take on-farm adaptation. Those that provide direct services, working most closely with farmers providing integrated services on the ground, are generally very knowledgeable about what farmers need in the specific areas in which they're sourcing. And these companies are more focused on short-term challenges at origin and largely driven by producer and client needs. For instance, Farmer Brothers Direct Trade Verified Sustainable Program, or DTVS, helps them to assess community needs and lead farmers to make community-led decisions for programs to address those needs. Technical assistance and training is the bulk of their work. Collaborating companies have a presence on the ground through implementing organizations. These companies work with others to provide holistic services to farmers. Depending on their degree of ownership over these on-the-ground programs, they range in their depth of knowledge or access to information about what farmers need in the specific areas in which they're sourcing. For example, Keurig focuses on building resilient supply chains, sustainable products, and thriving communities through investments made in supply chain to support producers in the uptake of climate-smart practices. Climate data and research has been incorporated into the advisory services of major programs such as the Coffee Farmer Resilience Initiative and the Blue Harvest Program to inform farmers and farmer organizations on practices to mitigate or adapt to changes in climate. Finally, catalysts are the most removed from the on-ground service provision. Instead of bottom-up, these companies are looking at the bigger picture, even outside of their own value chain. They may provide funding for research or services provision, may be visible as leaders in the sector, and may be interested in risk at origin, but are rarely implementing programs on the ground. And they're more focused on longer-term, large-scale challenges across the sector. So Lavazza, a member of the Coffee and Climate Initiative, would be an example of this. They work with the CNC to identify ways to help farmers to cope with climate change apart from their own supply chain, such as through water harvesting, including collection pools for drought, planting brachiara between coffee trees to keep soil moisture, or using gypsum to help coffee roots grow deeper, allowing trees to access water better. And many companies can be fluid among these categories depending on how they really function internally. But despite, oh, sorry, Caroline, go ahead. Thanks. Despite their differences, companies face similar challenges to CSA investment, some of which we hope to address through this learning series. There's often still confusion in what exactly CSA is and how companies can best incorporate it into their operations, as Kate was mentioning earlier. There's a lot of information out there, but decision makers aren't always sure where to go. And when they do find information, it's not always easily accessible or usable. For example, there's a call for analytics and tools to be better targeted and simpler for easier uptake by this private sector. We've also heard that the role of industry is critical but not complete. Companies need other actors to achieve resilience, and ongoing engagement and collaboration is critical for change. This is a long-term problem that must be met with long-term solutions. As for-profit entities, even when companies see the need for longer-term solutions, they often must first meet short-term financial goals, so support is really needed. Finally, even when everything else falls into place, getting information to farmers and improving adoption rates can still prove very difficult. Next, please. Since most adaptation work takes place at the farm level, most companies, collaborations of companies, or projects also take similar steps to address climate change, starting with understanding the climate risk in terms of geography and severity, and then identifying where farmers or suppliers sit within that risk. From there, they must understand farmer or supplier resilience and how it compares with the projected risk in order to identify resilience gaps. These identified resilience gaps inform program design and implementation. And lastly, program progress is monitored to figure out what's working and inform the next phase, possibly the scaling of a successful initiative. This, you will note, is largely the same flow as the learning series will take. So we're hoping the learning series will be very helpful in decision making. Next, please. So let's take a look at Olam coffee in Uganda as an example. As a service provider to its producers, Olam agronomists on the ground see the effects of climate change daily and see the changing weather and climate patterns as a threat to supply. In response, they're working with the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, namely IITA, HRNS, and CIAT, to gain a better understanding of climate-smart agriculture best practices and improve uptake of those practices by the farmers they work with. They're using demonstration plots to test climate-smart practices in particular environments that they can then recommend to their farmers. They're also exploring the use of weather stations in order to give farmers more accurate and timely information to make practices more effective. To improve uptake of CSA practices, Olam is working with IITA to conduct farmer segmentation and gender workshops that will inform the use of climate-smart investment pathways for farmer segments. These pathways, also known as stepwise investments, break down the full training package of CSA practices, including in the coffee and climate approach, into sequential and incremental steps that are aligned with the characteristics of different types of farmers and the need to build resilience. This will be accompanied by monitoring information that can be collected through the Stepwise app, using the 5Q approach developed by CIAT to more efficiently collect data. The team is currently figuring out how to best connect project monitoring with Olam's own Farmer Information System, or OFIS. You'll hear more about all these tools and resources as the learning series continues. Next, please. Climate change is here now, and the effects of climate change are projected to become more severe and impact coffee production all over the globe. At the same time, there's increasing demand for coffee, with production that in some places is struggling to keep pace. This is a long-term problem that requires long-term vision that produces smart solutions for both farmers and buyers. We face a massive challenge, but also an opportunity to grow together and work collaboratively to reduce the impacts of climate change. We hear again and again that this is not something companies can go at alone. So we're hoping that this learning series is the start of something positive, that will get tangible tools and resources into the hands of those who make decisions, and that fosters collaboration that can make a real difference. Next. Here are the resources that I mentioned earlier, along with a couple of other ones. These can also be found on the GCP website once it's posted after the webinar. And next. Great, so that is the end of our presentations. We'd love to open up the floor now to any questions or comments based on the presentations. You can use the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I'm going to open up the floor to that.
Or people could also raise their hand, so we can allow them to speak.
And while people are thinking about that, I might also pose one more question, just a general one. Since this is the first webinar that we're doing, we'd really like to get a good understanding of where people are and what they're hoping to get from this series. So I'd also like to just pose the question, if you'd like to answer this too, of what you see as the most pressing challenge associated with climate change and any promising solutions that you've seen that give you hope for the future.
Okay, and I'm seeing a couple questions that are trickling in. So one question is, where do we find details on the specifics for the rest of the series? And that can be found on the GCP website. Caroline, I don't know if maybe we can share the link directly in the chat box.
I will try.
Or not. But if you go to the GCP website and look under the Collective Action Network section and go to the CSA section, I think you can find it that way. And there was a question, will a list of participants in the webinar be available after the call? That's a good question.
Sorry, what was the question, that one?
Will a list of participants in the webinar be available after the call?
We'll see about that. I can understand. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay.
We also have a raised hand here. So maybe we take a live question from Pablo Ramirez. Shall I unmute him? So you're unmuted, Pablo. So,
all right, thank you. Yes, so thanks. This was great information. I just want to know if when you guys define CSA, the climate smart agriculture, I mean, I didn't see income diversification there. Is this something that you guys feel that should be included or not? And in my mind, I think it should be, but I would love to hear someone else to jump in if they agree with me.
Yeah, I think we do think that, and in fact, when we're talking about strategies for climate smart agriculture, that's exactly what we're talking about, is trying to, again, it's this balance of understanding what are the kind of current climate hazards that farmers are experiencing, what is the, generally speaking, the long-term prognosis for the area that they're working in, and then from there, what would be the most appropriate diversification strategies for them. So it could be considering adding additional, food crops and continuing with coffee. At the most extreme, it might be transitioning from Arabica to Robusta, or transitioning out of coffee and diversifying into different cash crops or out of farming. But yes, certainly we think that should be part of climate smart agriculture.
Great, thank you.
Kate, we have one question that I think you'd be best to answer as the ARC project manager about if the Alliance is open to collaborating with projects being implemented outside of Guatemala, Honduras, and Uganda, and what the next steps might be for that.
Yeah. So, as we said, we're using Guatemala, Honduras, and Uganda as our sort of testing grounds for collaborating with one another within this consortium on specific tools. We're also working with GCP and the national coffee platforms, as Caroline mentioned, in Honduras and in Uganda. And so those are the areas that we are, most focused and have the most presence and ability to deepen our work with private sector partners. Having said that, I think we recognize that that's just three countries of many countries that produce coffee, and many countries that are valuable to the coffee sector. So I think we're generally open to certainly implementing particular tools, especially we can share and look at more kind of discrete activities in other countries outside of those three. It's just, we're trying to sort of align and convene as many actors around these three countries as we can, just as a starting point. What would the next steps be for continuing the conversation? Get in touch with me. Let's have a conversation. I think that is the next step. Is just, I don't know which, it says M Laws. I'm not sure who that is or which company you're from, but we would be very interested in kind of just talking through, again, I think it's a conversation of what are you currently doing? How are you currently looking at climate? What are the challenges that you're finding in trying to address climate risks in your supply chain? And what are the ways that we can logically collaborate and support you? And we can take it from there.
Yeah, if I may add on to that, thank you, Kate. Is that, of course, the Global Coffee Platform is supporting 8 national coffee platforms. And within all these coffee platforms, there is an agenda point of addressing climate change, of course. So if there is great interest in another country to work on, to address issues, to come together to start a project, then yeah, you can please contact either one of the three of us, yeah, and then we will start a conversation on that.
Okay.
We did have a question just on the key findings from the Olam pilot in Uganda, and unfortunately it was very early days on that. So they have done the farmer segmentation, they've begun with the demonstration plots, and they are halfway through a set of 3 gender workshops. And so they are going to be incorporating those findings into the stepwise investment pathways, and then the training will start from there. So we will have updates on that as that project moves forward, but we're very excited about it.
Maybe I start taking the next one, Keely, which is someone asked, great initiative, but how should we take it from here? What should we do to participate, just turning in every week? Well, yes, that's a good starting. So these modules are to bring expertise and learning to you, addressing the challenges and showing also what is available right now. As I have mentioned in the beginning, we will also show a concrete cases for or investment opportunities in Honduras and Uganda. It's difficult, to be honest, in a webinar to bring together a group to discuss that in detail. So if you're interested in a specific topic or country, then the 3 of us will discuss and see how we can take that forward and manage participants. Yeah. So by all means, just turning in every week, yes and no, but of course, clearly we want to take that further, which you will also see at the end of the learning series, that we want to make you understand how collaboration works. And we will, as a global coffee platform, in our sustainability conference in November, which will be in Brazil, we will also showcase what we will achieve during this webinar with this series.
Mm-hmm. Caroline, I see, so there's a question, are these reports done in Guatemala, Honduras, and Uganda public? Where can we find them? Yes, generally speaking, all of the work that's being done within the Alliance for Resilient Coffee will be made available publicly. The key kind of platform that we will use for doing that will be the our project website we will be feeding information into, but especially any tools developed will go into the Coffee and Climate Toolbox onto that website. So there will be descriptions of different tools that we're testing out, different methodologies that we're testing out, and more information on how those are being tested in different sites. As Keely said, it is still somewhat early days in some of the activities that we're implementing, you know, although we're over a year into the project, given the nature of the coffee production cycle, it may be some time before we have some clear evidence or reports back on some of the things that we're implementing. But some other products and public goods that we've created in the project are going to be made available starting now, including at next week's module on risk analysis. We'll be introducing our coffee risk, climate risk profile for Honduras. And so CIAT will be walking us through the information included in that profile, and that will be made available again on our website in the Coffee and Climate Toolbox. And then in the coming months, we'll be adding the Guatemala and Uganda profiles as well.
So thank you, Kate. I see a raised hand from Thomas Delbar from Supremo. So I will unmute you and you may talk now. No. I'm clicking the unmute button, but it's not reacting. Kate, can you please try?
Can you hear me?
Ah, yeah, perfect. Now you're on.
All right, there you go. Good afternoon, good morning to those listening. I just had a quick question on transformative change, which was briefly mentioned on the slide titled, "What does CSA look like?" Transformative change via a switch to Robusta. It's indeed quite unavoidable that in the coming decades, the world will be producing and consuming more Robusta because of its resilience. But what was not mentioned, unless I missed it, was the climate change resistant varieties within the Arabica families. Is this something that will be discussed later on? Because there are around the world quite a few great laboratories, including some which partner with trade houses that are coming up with super resisting varieties, etc., etc. And if it is a point that will be mentioned in one of the future modules, to which extent would it be mentioned? Do we already have very clear ideas on how Arabica climate change resisting varieties can cope in an origin versus another, etc., etc.?
Yes.
Thank you for your replies.
Thank you. I love that question. Thank you for asking that. So yes, we are looking at resistant Arabica varieties, and we will be covering that within this series. So in the third module on, I forget now the name of it, what are ways that I can manage the effects of climate change in my supply chain, we'll be looking at a number of different practices and strategies, including changing Arabica varieties. And so we'll have World Coffee Research presenting on the work that they've been doing in testing different varieties, and they can give more information on which they find to be promising in which regions and what resources you can access to learn more about which varieties might be appropriate for your supply chain context. Having said that, I think the general approach of this series is to kind of keep in mind the audience and keep things relatively introductory and sort of accessible for a range of audiences, understanding that not everyone is an expert on varieties on coffee production directly, depending on the perspective you have within the value chain. So if you do want to get into more specific conversation and really get into more of the technical details, let's go through that module, and then we can connect you with World Coffee Research and others within the ARC consortium to get further into that topic. Okay.
And I did see one other question that was asking about why smallholder adoption is difficult, and I will take a stab at that, and then Kate, if you have anything to fill in, that would be great. So I think, we talked to a lot of coffee companies in the exercise of private sector consultation. And, there were a couple of things that people brought up. One was just reaching farmers with the appropriate information in a timely fashion was difficult. But the other, and probably the even bigger challenge, is that farming just poses a lot of risk to farmers. And so depending on what kind of farmers they are and what their priorities are and what their resources are, they're either better able to or not as inclined to adopt practices. So you might have a farmer on a large farm that has many resources, that has good training, that's able to adopt practices and know that they'll get a return on that. And those might be the farmers that you see renovating or rejuvenating their coffee trees. You might have a farmer on a smaller farm that only a segment of their income comes from coffee. They may be more invested in other crops or off-farm income. And so they may just manage the coffee in a way that best fits their family livelihood strategy. And then you may have a coffee farmer on a very small farm where the land size really isn't suitable to make a decent standard of living, where most of their income is coming from off-farm or other sources. And I think that keeping in mind that not all coffee farmers are wanting to be professionalized coffee farmers or are able to be professionalized coffee farmers is something to really keep in mind as we go through this whole series. And that's part of the segmentation work that I was talking about earlier that's happening with IITA and Olam in Uganda. Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was a great answer. Thanks, Keely.
So I'd like to take another question where someone is asking, are those initiatives exclusive to GCP members only? If you refer to the cases we're going to show or bring to you in Honduras and go to Honduras and Uganda, no, they will be open to, because they happen also or will be conducted under the platform. So they are open also to non-GCP members.
Okay. And I see a question here, what is the role of the national governments? How are you involving them in these programs? And of course, it depends on the country and the way that the government is involved in the coffee sector in the particular country. But I would give an example in Honduras. We're working closely with eCafe, the Coffee Institute there. They have been involved in supporting providing information that we're using for our risk analysis. We are working with them directly in testing of different tools, including different coffee varieties, including training their staff on our climate adaptation extension approach, the coffee and climate methodology. So we're really working hand in hand with them and view them as a very obvious scaling mechanism, but also a way to collect more data. In the case of Uganda, where again, as part of the national coffee platform, we're also working closely with the UCDA, the Uganda Coffee Development Authority, where we've been supporting them with extension materials and also exchanging information. So we're certainly involving, and as well in Guatemala and a cafe, we are working with them in piloting specific tools, for example, a climate vulnerability, on-farm climate vulnerability measurement tool. So we're working hand in hand with governments.
And if I may add on to that, thanks, Kate, is that in Uganda, the case we're developing, there is a climate change working group under the National Coffee Platform, UCDA, and we are very closely working as ARC or parts of the ARC partners and GCP working together to develop this this opportunity. Yeah?
Okay, and I see a question from William Ferreira about opportunities to implement climate smart programming in Brazil. And as we talked about before, we're focused on Central America and East Africa. However, I would just note that the Neumann Foundation has been very active in that region of Brazil, as has the Global Coffee Platform. So I think there may be opportunities to see how collaborative activities develop. So I would stay tuned in this series and certainly be in touch with Caroline or myself about that, and we can see how things develop.
Yeah, another question comes from Castine. Thank you very much. She's asking, will there be a joint action that everyone should report back on? So we're going to show you those two cases from Honduras and Uganda. And we hopefully then find organizations, companies who are ready to collaborate. Yes, for those, we would want them to report back on what's being achieved. I think generally in terms of monitoring, we will show you more in Module 5 how that would work. GCP is developing the Sustainable Progress Framework, but I don't want to go into the depth of it, where your activities and the impact then can be put in. There are other projects within GCP to measure the impact, especially in Brazil and Vietnam. So is there one joint action you can report back on? I would say no and yes, and I hope I explained that enough. I hope that answers the question.
We did just get a logistics question as well. If you registered for the webinar, you will be receiving an invite for the next webinar once the first one has passed, or once the previous one has passed. And then you can just use that Zoom link for the next webinar. But again, all of the dates and times are up on the GCP website. So if you want to hold in your own calendar, that is great too.
Yeah, and so if I may add on to that, we will send out after each webinar, we will send out an invite like you have received already, where you can either go straight into the webinar or put it into your calendar, and you also find the link into, there. So you don't have to register for each and every one. And we will also share the list of participants, and of course, as mentioned already, we will put on our website this recording and the slide deck.
Great. And then I just want to open up the floor one more time in case anybody has, you know, not even specific questions, but if you have additional comments about what you find most challenging about this work, what you find most hopeful or promising about this work, or any information that you find is missing. We'd love to hear from you, not just because we feel like we're in this kind of all together and it's good to share our challenges and our hopes, but also because we're hoping that it can help to inform the rest of the learning series. So if anybody wants to raise their hand or use the chat to comment on that, we can give a few minutes in case anyone feels inclined, and if not, then I can pass it to Caroline to wrap up.
Yeah, there's another question from Williams where it's being asked, I'm a research on EPAMIC, Company for Research in Minas Gerais, Brazil. Our research is about climate change impacts on coffee quality. Not a question. I'm sure you would be in touch with the Brazil Coffee Platform. Yeah, maybe you would be ready also in one of our webinars to contribute with your knowledge. That would be great. So I think there are no more questions right now. Then I would move on to the next slide, which brings us towards the end of our webinar. So today we have covered understanding climate change. Thank you very much to Keely and Kate, and I have noted a few things down, learning myself, covering the terminology and also the threats of climate, explaining what climate smart agriculture actually means. You gave a glimpse of what's being done already and some of the successes. I was quite impressed on the pictures of Honduras. I'm sure it's not always going that quickly. And also the challenges of the investments into climate smart agriculture. So today we gave you a glimpse of the challenge and understanding it. And then next week, Tuesday, at the same time, we will show and address how climate change is affecting the supply chain by moving into risk profiles. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us and also for your contributions and making this a very good webinar. If you do have any questions, any further ideas or questions on collaboration on countries, please do not hesitate to contact us. You find our email addresses here. And with that, I would like to thank everyone again for joining, wishing you a good evening, afternoon, or morning, a good rest of the day. And I hope to see you again on Tuesday. And thanks so much, Keely and Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And thanks to everybody who joined.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.